It was found that while many companies express interest in Jacobson's use case approach, actual scenario usage often falls outside what is described in textbooks and standard methodologies. Users therefore face significant scenario management problems not yet addressed adequately in theory or practice and are demanding solutions to these problems. The latest scientific evidence on the nature and strength of the links between diet and chronic diseases is examined and discussed in detail in the following sections of this report. This section gives an overall view of the current situation and trends in chronic diseases at the global level. Most succulent plants are found in regions where there is little rainfall, dry air, plenty of sunshine, porous soils, and high temperatures during part of the year. These conditions have caused changes in plant structures, which have resulted in greatly increased thickness of stems, leaves, and sometimes roots, enabling them to store moisture from the infrequent rains. The Atlantic coast of the peninsula can be thought of as the cold side, and the sea on this coast tends to be clear and cold, with a variety of seaweeds growing along the rocky shoreline. On a hot day, however, this cold water can be very refreshing and is said to be less hospitable to sharks, which prefer warmer waters. The starting point of Bergson's theory is the experience of time and motion. Time is the reality we experience most directly, but this doesn't mean that we can capture this experience mentally. The past is gone and the future is yet to come. The only reality is the present, which is real through our experience. Answering such complex question with a simple yes or no is impossible. Answering such complex question with a simple yes or no is impossible. Apple is expected to announce several new products this fall. Apple is expected to announce several new products this fall. Books which are overdue will incur daily fine. Books which are overdue will incur daily fine. Distance learning has become far more popular these days. Distance learning has become far more popular these days. Electric cars are the future of transportation as they promise a cleaner environment. Electric cars are the future of transportation as they promise a cleaner environment. Every year students pass biology course easily. Every year students pass biology course easily. Extra seminars to be scheduled to assist you with revision. Extra seminars to be scheduled to assist you with revision. Government policies, though tough, have been a blessing in disguise. Government policies, though tough, have been a blessing in disguise. He kept giving me suggestive looks. He kept giving me suggestive looks. This given image represents the best and appropriate way to wash hands. To begin with, wet the hands first and then take an adequate amount of liquid soap. The third step is to rub the hands against each other with the opposite palm and with fingers interlaced. Then, the thumb is clasped with the opposite palm and fingertips are also rubbed with opposite palm. Finally, wrists are scrubbed and at the end, the hands are rinsed with running water to get rid of soap and the foam. Overall, to avoid the spread of diseases, this procedure of washing hands should be followed every time. The given image represents about food chain. According to the image, the first step is that bees pollinate flowers from the green trees, followed by the second step in which the small fish eat those bees. The third step is that the small fish grow up into big ones. The fourth step is that the big fish are eaten by a grizzly bear and fish bones remain, which nourish trees. In conclusion, the whole process will repeat, which represents how the whole process is done. The following image provides the information about how grapes come to the customers. According to the image, the first step is that fresh and ripped purple grapes are picked, which is followed by the second step, in which the grapes are loaded onto a truck and transported. After that, the third step is that the grapes move on a conveyor belt, followed by the fourth step, in which the grapes are stowed into a paper box as its package. The final step is that the grapes loaded in a cart, which means the grapes reach customers. In conclusion, this process is very informative. The given image shows the information about the steel recycling process. According to the image, we can say that there are 9 steps in the process, which includes the collection, sorting by a magnet, steel slugging, grinding, furnace, forming, flatter, and the end product. To begin with, first of all, the collection of waste takes place. Then this garbage is passed through sorting magnet to separate the steel out of waste. Thereafter, steel slugging takes place, is followed by grinding. Further, this material is put in a furnace. Then forming of the material takes place, is followed by flatter process. Finally, the end product is ready, which can be anything such as a car, a washing machine, etc. Overall, the process chart is helpful in understanding the steel recycling process. The image shows a chemistry lab with a lab attendant. To begin with, we can say that there are a couple of things visible in the image that include beakers, jars, pivot tube, etc. According to the image, the lab attendant is doing some chemical test. There are some bottles to the right side of the lab attendant, which are having some red color chemical in them. There are some empty containers also in the image. On the left-hand side of the lab attendant, there are some big brown color containers. In conclusion, the image is quite useful in learning the general setup of a chemical lab. The given image represents the information about correct hand position while typing on a keyboard. According to the image, we can see a detailed information about right and wrong hand placement that should be followed while on a keyboard for a long durations. Moreover, it can be clearly seen that the correct way of hand placement is to have the hands at the equal distance, with the palm hovering over the keyboard, whereas the typing with the palms resting on the keyboard is likely to increase the joint pains in hands in the long run. Overall, we can say that this image illustrates important information that is strongly supported by the facts and figures.
Have you experienced déjà vu? It's that shadowy feeling you get when a situation seems familiar. A scene in a restaurant plays out exactly as you remember. The world moves like a ballet you've choreographed. But this sequence can't be based on a past experience because you've never eaten here before. This is the first time you've had clams. So what's going on? Unfortunately, there isn't one single explanation for déjà vu. The experience is brief and occurs without notice, making it nearly impossible for scientists to record and study it. Scientists can't simply sit around and wait for it to happen to them. This could take years. It has no physical manifestations and in studies, described by the subject as a sensation or feeling. Because of this lack of hard evidence, there's been a surplus of speculation over the years. Since Émile Boirac introduced déjà vu as a French term meaning already seen, more than 40 theories attempt to explain this phenomenon.
The lecture is about déjà vu. According to the speaker, sometimes you feel that the present familiar situation has happened with you before. She describes a situation of a restaurant which seems like a ballet you have choreographed. So, based on a past experience because you've never eaten here before. She talks about this experience which happens suddenly, and it's impossible for scientists to record and study it. In the studies, it is described by the subject as a sensation or feeling. Overall, we can say that this lecture is very useful.
Talk to you today a little bit about predictable irrationality. And my interest in irrational behavior started many years ago in hospital. I was burned very badly. And if you spend a lot of time in hospital, you'll see a lot of types of irrationalities. And the one that particularly bothered me in the burn department was the process by which the nurses took the bandage off me. Now, you must have all taken a Band-Aid off at some point, and you must have wondered what's the right approach. Do you rip it off quickly, short duration but high intensity, or do you take your Band-Aid off slowly? You take a long time, but each second is not as painful. Which one of those is the right approach? The nurses in my department thought that the right approach was the ripping one. So they would grab hold, and they would rip, and they would grab hold, and they would rip. And because I had 70% of my body burned, it would take about an hour. And as you can imagine, I hated that moment of ripping with incredible intensity.
The lecture was about irrationality. Speaker mentioned his behavior of irrationality when he was in the hospital. Speaker explained his own experience when he was burned very badly and he spent a lot of time in the hospital. Speaker mentioned that this behavior bothered him in the burn department when the nurses took the bandage off. Overall, we can say that the speaker explained his behavior of irrationality.
Absolutely. There's a lot of interest in what forms those clouds. Why are those clouds there? Why do they stick around? At the center of every cloud drop is a particle. You can't grow a cloud drop without having a particle there for the water to condense on. The key questions that people have not directly addressed until very recently is what actually forms those clouds. And so the ones that you're looking at over the ocean, it turns out sea salt is a very effective nucleator for forming clouds, so there's a really good chance that those are loaded with sea salt. But as you go inland and you start to have pollution come from all different kinds of sources, and so different sources form clouds more effectively than others, and we're trying to unravel which sources are actually contributing to the clouds. The clouds are incredibly important players in climate change in that they reflect the light back to space, and so they're keeping things much cooler than they would be if they weren't there. They also play a huge role in regional weather. So we're actually starting to see shifts where having more pollution input into the clouds is affecting weather patterns, and in particular it's actually reducing the amount of precipitation. So we're starting to see drought in areas with super high levels of air pollution.
The speaker is discussing the clouds in details. First and foremost, she talks about the center of every cloud drop, which is a particle. Secondly, she mentions that there is a really good chance that forming clouds are loaded with sea salt. Another key is that the clouds are incredibly important players in climate change, in that they reflect the light back to space. Moreover, she explains that they also play a huge role in regional weather. Overall, we can say that the lecture is very useful.
A notice of death in a newspaper. How many countries are involved in a mutual agreement? How many years are there in a millennium? What can't you do after drinking? What color is the medal if you win the competition? What do you call a person who make a living by serving people food? What do you call a person who write novels for a living? What is the antonym of predecessor? When trains or cars need to go through a mountain, where do they enter the mountain? Where is the solar energy coming from?
We're going to spend the rest of the month writing different kinds of essays. First, though, we need to talk about what makes an essay good. There are certain things that every essay, despite what you'll be writing about, needs to have. Okay, so who can tell me one thing that an essay must have?
Doesn't every essay need an introduction?
Of course, every essay must have an introduction. In the intro, you'll talk about the focus of your essay. You might also talk about some of your arguments or subtopics, but if you do, you have to make sure that you're very brief about them. Your introduction shouldn't be more than a paragraph. So what else does an essay need to have?
A conclusion?
Absolutely. If you're introducing your topic at the beginning, you must conclude your argument at the end. The conclusion talks about similar things as the introduction, but it's not exactly the same. Here you have to wrap up your topic. You have to make sure that the reader is convinced that your point of view is right. Yes, do you have a question?
So what happens in the middle?
The middle's the most important part. That's where you tell your reader all the reasons that he or she should agree with you. That's where you really get to show off what you know.
All right, class. Yesterday I told you that we were going to start looking at a field of psychology called Developmental Psychology. This branch of psychology looks at the many ways people's minds and bodies develop from before they're even born until they die. So we should just start at the beginning, I think. Let's start with infants. So, when a baby is born, up until he or she starts talking, the baby is referred to as an infant. Infants can't do a lot of things that older children can do. Let's look at the physical side of things. Babies are born with really poor vision. Actually, they're legally blind when born. Infants can mostly make out large shapes and stuff, but they can't tell detail. Also, their sense of colour isn't very good. For a long time, psychologists thought infants were colorblind right after birth. As it turns out, research has shown that most babies can, in fact, make out bright colors. For example, an infant can tell the difference between a bright red ball and a bright blue ball. But it would be much harder for an infant to tell the difference between a light blue ball and a dark blue ball. Anyway, as infants get older, their sense of sight improves. Some psychologists think that by the age of 6 months, an infant's vision will be almost the same as an adult's.
And now, class, let's switch gears and discuss a different topic. Consumer Price Index, CPI for short. If you switched on the TV and heard on the news that the CPI in Canada was 2.1%, what does that mean? In a nutshell, it means that Canadian consumers paid 2.1% more than in the previous year for the goods and services included in the CPI basket. Although prices of goods and services rise and fall over time, when prices change too dramatically, they can have negative effects on an economy. In order to tell if an economy is experiencing inflation, deflation, or stagflation, we use the CPI as a gauge of the prices of goods and services. Believe it or not, when the Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Statistics releases the CPI data monthly, the CPI's results are widely anticipated and watched. Who would eagerly await the results, you might ask? Well, the CPI plays a role for many key financial decision makers, including individual investors, the Bank of Canada in Canada, and the Federal Reserve in the U.S. The CPI helps the Bank of Canada forecast the interest rate policy and other decisions of major banks and corporations. I mentioned the CPI basket before, and now I want to expand on what this basket is and how we get the information. The base year market basket, which makes up the CPI, comes from detailed expenditure information collected from surveys of thousands of families. The information is not randomly collected. Instead, the information is gathered through interviews and diaries kept by participants who have agreed to disclose their buying habits. The basket is divided into 8 groups: food and beverages, housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, recreation, education and communication, and other goods and services, and includes more than 200 categories. Finally, the prices of 80,000 items in the market basket are collected monthly from thousands of retail stores, service establishments, rental units, and doctors' offices.
South Korea's LG Electronics is banking on its new smart fridge, becoming an essential component of kitchens around the world. The smart fridge is a technological marvel compared to fridges of the past. It boasts a food management system that maintains a list of the food it is storing. It also records the expiry dates of the foods and sends out an alert via Wi-Fi when that date has been reached. The information can be accessed via a smartphone by consumers as they shop in grocery stores, allowing them to make informed decisions about food purchases. LG adds that its fridge can also suggest healthy recipes based on what it knows is inside.
One day in 1819, 3,000 miles off the coast of Chile, in one of the most remote regions of the Pacific Ocean, 20 American sailors watched their ship flood with seawater. They'd been struck by a sperm whale, which had ripped a catastrophic hole in the ship's hull. As their ship began to sink beneath the swells, the men huddled together in 3 small whaleboats. These men were 10,000 miles from home and more than 1,000 miles from the nearest scrap of land. In their small boats, they carried only rudimentary navigational equipment and limited supplies of food and water. These were the men of the whale ship Essex, whose story would later inspire parts of Moby Dick. Now, some of us naturally read our fears more closely than others. I read about a study recently of successful entrepreneurs, and the author found that these people shared a habit that he called productive paranoia, which meant that these people, instead of dismissing their fears, these people read them closely, they studied them, and then they translated that fear into preparation and action. So that way, if their worst fears came true, their businesses were ready.
Now, let's consider two types of mistakes that can occur when a manager actually starts to set up a duplicate system to replicate a successful process. Firstly, perhaps he forgets that he was just trying to copy another process and starts trying to improve on it. Another mistake is trying to use the best parts of various different systems in the hope of creating the perfect combination. Unfortunately, attempts like these usually turn out to be misguided and lead to problems. Why? Well, for various reasons. Perhaps there weren't really any advantages after all, because the information wasn't accurate. Perhaps the business settings weren't really comparable. More typically, the advantages are real enough, but there are also disadvantages that have been overlooked. For example, the modification might compromise safety in some way. So what's the solution? Well, I don't intend to suggest that it's easy to get things right the second time. It's not. But the underlying problem has more to do with attitudes than the actual difficulty of the task, and there are ways of getting it right. These involve adjusting attitudes, being more realistic and cautious, really. As an immigrant to North America, you will need to ensure that employers and organizations such as colleges and universities properly recognize your international credentials. These may be trade certificates, but also educational qualifications such as degrees or diplomas that you have completed or partially completed. It is common for hiring personnel to have little or no training in evaluating an academic background earned outside of North America. But at the same time, employers see formal education as very important when hiring. Research has shown that sometimes immigrants start with a lower salary than people who have completed their training in North America. If you need to complete your training in North America, apprenticeships leading to skilled trades are in high demand.
In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. led a massive demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama. The protest was against racism in the United States. People, including children and teenagers, took to the streets to fight for their rights. However, tragically, police officers and firefighters tried to stop them with dogs and high-pressure water hoses. They were brutally attacked by dogs and torrents of water from fire hoses. These scenes were shown in newspapers and on televisions around the world. Of course, these scenes touched people's hearts, so the demonstrators gained support against segregation.
Both the rotation of the moon and its revolution around Earth takes 27 days, 7 hours, and 43 minutes to be exact. Because of this motion, the moon appears to move about 13 degrees against the stars each day, or about half of a degree per hour. If you watch the moon over the course of several hours one night, you will notice that its position among the stars will change by a few degrees. The changing position of the moon with respect to the sun leads to lunar phases.
In some ways, mental development is related to social development in school-aged children. Between the ages of 6 and 12, children move from being able to think only on a concrete level, that is, about real objects they can touch, to being capable of abstract thought. In their social development, children gradually acquire interpersonal reasoning skills. They learn to understand the feelings of other people, and also learn that a person's actions or words don't always reflect their
Bread and cereals have a long history. The first bread was made in the Nile Valley about 10,000 years ago. The people used stones to crush the grain into coarse flour, and then they made the flour into primitive forms of bread. Primitive bread was not like the bread we know today because it was simply flour dough dried on heated stones. The invention of ovens came later. Leavened breads and cakes, which are made to rise by the action of yeast, were also a discovery of the ancient Egyptians. The Egyptians were the first people to master the art of baking. News of this new wonder food spread to other places in the Middle East. Soon other people were collecting seed, cultivating land, and inventing ways to turn grain into flour. Baking used to be a social activity. While some homes had their own ovens, many families had to bake their dough in communal bakeries. To identify their loaves, each household would make a distinctive mark on the bread, sometimes with a special stamp bearing the family.
Got a minute? The element mercury has been shown to damage the human nervous system. Yet, since 1856, mercury amalgam is the filling dentists have used to repair our teeth. Now, a study in the journal Chemical Research and Toxicology indicates that mercury fillings actually lose their toxic potential over time. Canadian scientists use X-ray spectroscopy to compare new mercury amalgams to those about 20 years old. After 2 decades, 95% of the elemental mercury on the surface of a filling had gone through a chemical reaction. It became beta mercury sulfide, a black-colored solid, which explains why fillings dull with age. And the compound isn't absorbed by the body, which means it can't affect the body the way elemental mercury can. Of course, this study does not settle the question of how potentially harmful a new mercury filling is, but sulfide-rich foods such as coffee, garlic, and onions may accelerate the change from metallic mercury into the safer sulfide. So if you have a new mercury filling, an odoriferous chili dog with a cup of coffee may be just what the doctor ordered.
years, scientists and physicians have been up in arms about the rise in antibiotic resistance. Seems that many bacteria, devious buggers that they are able to share genetic information, including, say, the instructions for destroying penicillin. Well, if that's not bad enough, scientists from the NYU School of Medicine have found that some bacteria can use viruses to help them pass along the recipe for their favorite toxin, results published in the journal Science. Like humans, bacteria are also prone to infection by viruses, and most of these viruses, called bacteriophage, or phage for short, make their bacterial victims sick, or even dead. But in the laboratory, the scientists discovered that Staphylococcus aureus, the bug that causes toxic shock syndrome, among other things, can actually co-opt phage, using them to shuttle the gene for toxic shock toxin to another bacteria, in this case Listeria. That's doubly nasty because Listeria on its own causes food poisoning, so if it added toxic shock to its repertoire, well, that would be one seriously bad bug. Whether Staph aureus can pull off this stunt outside the lab's not clear, but in its particular battle, you gotta hope the viruses come out on top.
Good educator can recognize the different kinds of learning styles. Politicians need to be more practical when they are addressing the issues. Fast food has become very popular with many students. There are many concerns about the research, for example, financial considerations. There is a point between chemistry and other side of subjects.